Okay, our next group of disorders that we're going to look at are personality disorders and dissociative disorders. And it is important for you to know the difference between these two types of disorders. So we're going to start with dissociative disorders. And we first need to talk about what dissociation means and why it makes these disorders not personality disorders. So dissociation is kind of like daydreaming or getting lost in the moment while working on a project. It's characterized by separating critical parts of your personality, like memory or consciousness or identity, that are normally integrated and work together. So the memory is separated from your consciousness, or your consciousness is separated from your memory. These temporary dissociative states are fairly common. Think about like when you drive to a very common place, so like to school or to work, and you realize you don't remember going through an intersection or stopping at a stoplight or even getting there at all, right? You don't remember that whole route. That's a dissociative state, right? Like we have separated our consciousness from our memory. So dissociative disorders are this separation of critical parts of our personality, okay? So separating those personality pieces from them. Whereas personality disorders are going to be the entire personality, okay? So the first dissociative disorder and the main dissociative disorder that we need to talk about and that you need to know is dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder, oftentimes referred to as DID. In this condition, the person appears to have two or more distinct personalities, okay? And each of these personalities can speak, act, and write in different ways. So these different identities dissociate from each other, meaning that they are distinct. They have their own memories, their own wishes, their own impulses that are split away from, dissociated, or taken away from, split from the other personality, okay? The problem is that we only have one body, right? And so these distinct personalities that have to fight or take turns being at the forefront, being within the consciousness. Because there's a strong variation from personality to personality, a person's behavior could really look inconsistent or erratic because they're going from different state to different state, right? So these personalities are distinct. They have separate memories, separate consciousness, separate impulses, and that's what makes this so distinct. So some famous cases of DID, Herschel Walker, he wrote a book called Breaking Free. He's a former NFL running back. He talks about how he dealt with more than a dozen personalities throughout his life, and each of these personalities dealt with the major parts of his life. So one of the personalities was a loving father, another was a cutthroat football player, another was a hardcore businessman, et cetera, et cetera. So these identities were separate from each other. Another case would be Chris Sizemore. Her case was actually made into the movie The Three Faces of Eve. Three of Chris's distinct personalities were depicted in the book that then became a movie and referred to as Eve Black, Eve White, and Intellectual Jane. So we have the meek and bland Eve White, dominant and carefree Eve Black, and then mature and intellectual Jane. And then probably the most famous case is the case of Shirley Mason, or Sybil, as she was referred to in this case study. In the early 1950s, Mason was a substitute teacher at Columbia and a student at Columbia University. She long suffered from blackouts and emotional breakdowns, and finally she entered into therapy with Cornelia Wilbur, who is a Freudian psychiatrist. And their sessions together are the basis of the book Sybil. Okay. Mason later moved to Lexington, Kentucky, where she taught art. and ran an art gallery. You can see here there's a picture of some of her artwork where one personality drew one way and another personality drew another way. These are just some of the examples of the personalities of Sybil. One of them was even a baby. Another were going through different genders. Another one was intensely religious. Others are teenagers. And so you can see that these personalities are very distinct from another and can take on the role of different genders, different ages, different nationalities sometimes. And so they're very distinct, and you can see how this can be very disturbing and dysfunctional for a person who's suffering from this. So how does DID develop? Well, psychoanalytic psychologists would say that it is the massive repression of unwanted impulses or memories, so much so that we create a new person or a new personality that acts out those unacceptable behaviors and can recall those unacceptable or unbearable memories. Behaviorists say that everyone is capable of acting in different ways in different situations. However, people with this disorder take it to the extreme, that they act so different that they feel like a different person, and that the symptoms are often strengthened by the reward that not remembering something allows you to kind of escape from that stressful situation. However, when we're evaluating the true cause of DID, it's really difficult to figure that out because this disorder is so rare. Most clinicians believe that the root cause is some sort of abuse or trauma, and the child is then separating themselves from that abuse or trauma as a way to deal with it. And then they continue to do that throughout the rest of their lives, and the different personalities are being separated from different stressful events. Okay, so each time they go through a stressful event, they're going to separate into a new personality. There's also some people and some psychiatrists who do not believe DID is an actual disorder. They believe that the individual may just be a con artist or role playing to ease the anxieties in his or her life. Okay, let's talk next about personality disorders. Personality disorders are long-standing, inflexible personality traits that impair social functioning. So these are just like people's personalities. The problem is that they come in and they impair your daily life, your social functioning. There's 3 different clusters of personality disorders. Cluster A is someone is going to exhibit odd or eccentric behavior. Cluster B is going to exhibit dramatic or emotional behavior. And then finally, cluster C is going to exhibit anxious or fearful behavior. Oftentimes, people seek treatment purely because other people told them to. These are their personalities. This is how they've always been. And so it doesn't really bother them, right? Because this is who they are. But a court order may force them to seek treatment, or pressure from a family member may force them to seek treatment because the individual really, it doesn't bother them that they have these personality traits. So let's look at each of the 3 clusters. The first is cluster A. The first is paranoid personality disorder. This is characterized by paranoia and a pervasive, which means long-standing, suspiciousness and generalized mistrust of others. We're going to talk about this one in the next slide, so I'm going to come back to it. The next is schizoid. Schizoid is a pattern of indifference, meaning you don't really care about social relationships. There's a limited range of emotional expression and experience, meaning this person doesn't really care about being in really any sort of social relationship. They don't really care to feel emotional, don't really care to be going through any sort of emotional situations. It manifests itself in by early adulthood, and we usually see it through social and emotional detachments. And then this prevents people from really having any close relationships. So The person could be in a long-standing relationship and then they kind of just detach from that relationship and it doesn't really bother them. They don't really care. The next is schizotypal, which is a similar name but different in what it is. So schizotypal is a pattern of social and interpersonal difficulties. So schizoid is you don't really want to have a social relationship. Schizotypal is that there's discomfort with those social relationships. So schizoid doesn't want it, so it doesn't bother them that they don't have close relationships. Schizotypal, it's going to bother them. It causes them discomfort to have a social relationship. Often it comes with eccentric behavior, unusual thoughts and perceptions of reality. Usually they're experiencing distorted thinking. They might behave strangely and avoid intimacy because it makes them uncomfortable. So let's talk about paranoid personality disorder. This is pervasive distrust and suspiciousness. So meaning they're going to be constantly thinking that there's mistrust or untrustworthy people or deceit going on. So they might think that other people are exploiting them or deceiving them. Their friends and associates are untrustworthy. Information that is confided to others will be used against them. They might think that there's hidden meaning in what people say or events. So they're like, oh, what do you think they meant by that? And then the spouse or partner they think is unfaithful. So there's a lot of suspicion going on, a lot of distrust. Okay, cluster B. The first is borderline personality disorder. This is marked by an ongoing pattern of varying moods, self-image, and behavior. These symptoms often result in impulsive actions and problems in relationships. We're going to come back to this one, so just keep that there. Histrionic is characterized by a pattern of excessive attention-seeking emotions. Usually it's beginning in early adulthood. This person is going to be constantly looking for attention and they're going to do very dramatic things in order to get that attention. This could be inappropriate seductive behavior, excessive sexual behavior, so they might be promiscuous. There also is an excessive need for approval. So this person is constantly looking for other people to like them or want to be around them. Finally, narcissistic, probably the most well-known. You've probably heard of it before. This is a long-term pattern of abnormal behavior characterized by exaggerated feelings of self-importance, excessive need for admiration, and lack of empathy. Really, this person doesn't really care about what you think or how you feel because what they are going through to them is more important. They need to do whatever they can to be in the spotlight. They need for people to think that they are awesome. They feel like they are more important than anyone else in the room. And they really don't care how you feel because how they feel is more important. Okay, so borderline personality disorder is the unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, self-perception, and moods, meaning that they have really bad impulse control. They cannot really keep relationships with people because they're unstable, they're intense. They usually are going to do a lot to avoid abandonment. They're going to have a really unstable self-image, meaning they have really bad self-esteem. Usually they're very impulsive in at least 2 areas that are self-damaging, so they might do things to bring attention to them or to make sure that they aren't abandoned. Recurrent suicidal behaviors or threats of self-mutilation, again, to seek that attention and get people to stay with them. Affective instability, meaning their emotions are unstable. Chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate or intense anger, and then transient paranoia or dissociation, meaning it comes and goes. Oftentimes, people with borderline personality disorder are going